You know what I've realized after spending the last 5 years watching how people manage their money in 2026? The old formulas don't work anymore, and honestly, it's driving me absolutely insane. My name is Lenny, and I spend way too much time thinking about how the financial world has completely transformed in just the last few years. How inflation has destroyed purchasing power. How the job market looks nothing like it did in 2020. And why the advice your parents gave you about money is now basically financial fiction. If you're someone who actually wants to understand how to build real wealth in this new economy, where everything costs twice as much and stability feels like a luxury, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Because what I'm about to share with you is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about money. Here's something that might absolutely shock you about where we are in 2026. The cost of living has increased by more than 40% since 2020, but wages have only risen about 23% in most industries, which means the average person is actually financially worse off than they were 6 years ago, even if they've gotten raises along the way. Meanwhile, the traditional financial advice that worked so well in the 1990s and 2000s is now basically useless because the world has changed in ways that nobody could have predicted 5 years ago. The rules about retirement accounts, about how to build wealth, about what investments actually make sense anymore. All of that has shifted on its axis. Real estate isn't the guaranteed wealth builder it used to be because prices have gotten so astronomical that most people under 40 have basically zero chance of ever buying a home in the traditional sense. The stock market is more volatile than ever before, and honestly, trying to time it or pick individual stocks is even more dangerous than it used to be. So let me tell you about a completely new framework for thinking about money in 2026. That actually addresses the world we live in today, instead of the world our parents lived in. That actually addresses the world we live in today, instead of the world our parents lived in. But today, with the cost of living being what it is, having just 3 months of expenses isn't nearly enough protection anymore, especially if you're living in any major city or if you have dependents who rely on you. The world has become so unpredictable that you now need what I call a stability buffer that's much bigger than what the old rules suggested. For people in 2026, I actually recommend building an emergency fund that covers between 6 to 12 months of living expenses, depending on your situation and your income volatility. Yes, that sounds like a lot, but here's why it matters so much more now than it ever did before. The job market is completely unstable. Companies are laying off people constantly, sometimes with no warning whatsoever, which means you can't count on finding a new job in a matter of weeks the way you used to be able to. Freelancers and gig workers are now a massive portion of the workforce, and they have zero job security whatsoever, so they need even more financial cushion. Medical emergencies are now exponentially more expensive than they were just a few years ago. And even with health insurance, a serious health crisis can bankrupt you faster than almost anything else. Having that bigger buffer means you can actually weather the storms that life throws at you without destroying everything you've built. Here's the thing that drives me crazy about people who dismiss this advice as too conservative. They say things like, oh, that's way too much money sitting around doing nothing. It's about recognizing that the world is fundamentally more unstable than it was even a decade ago, and being smart enough to plan accordingly. That safety net is what gives you the psychological space to make good decisions about everything else, which ironically is what actually accelerates your path to wealth. Once you've built that substantial emergency fund, the next step in the new money formula is something that would have seemed weird to say 10 years ago, but now it's absolutely critical. You need to diversify your income streams, and I'm not talking about the traditional advice of getting a side hustle. What I mean is that you need to build a financial structure where your money comes from multiple sources, because relying on a single job from a single employer is now basically financial recklessness. A full-time job is important, absolutely, but it should only be one component of your total income picture. This might mean that you develop a freelance business that brings in money, or you create digital products, or you offer services related to your expertise, or you build some kind of passive income stream that generates money while you sleep. The specifics don't matter nearly as much as the principle, which is that you never ever want to be in a position where losing one job means losing everything. Think about it logically. If you're relying entirely on one employer for 100% of your income, then you have zero leverage and zero security. But if your income comes from 4 different sources and you lose one of them, you've only lost 25% of your income, which is a manageable crisis instead of a catastrophic one. Building multiple income streams in 2026 isn't really a luxury anymore or something that's just for ambitious people. It's become a basic survival strategy for anyone who wants to actually feel secure about their financial future. The job market is too unstable, employment is too uncertain, and the cost of living is too high for any other approach to make sense. The third element of the new money formula is something that's gotten almost impossible to ignore in 2026, and it's about understanding inflation protection in ways that the old financial advice never really addressed. Inflation isn't just an economic statistic that appears in the news every month. Inflation is eating your wealth alive if you're not actively protecting yourself against it. Real inflation in 2026 is significantly higher than the official numbers that governments report because the official numbers are calculated in ways that don't match how real people actually spend their money. Food costs more, housing costs way more, energy costs more, medical care costs way more. So if you're sitting on your money in regular savings accounts earning 0.05% interest while inflation is running at 5 to 7%, you're actually losing money every single year. Your purchasing power is declining even though the number in your bank account looks the same. This is why the new money formula requires you to think very differently about where you keep your wealth and what investments you prioritize. You need to have a significant portion of your assets in things that protect you against inflation. This includes real assets like real estate, if you can afford it. It includes dividend-paying stocks that can increase their payouts as inflation goes up. It includes treasury inflation-protected securities, which specifically adjust for inflation. And it includes other hard assets that maintain their value as the currency weakens. The old conventional wisdom used to say that you should have maybe 70% of your portfolio in stocks and 30% in bonds because that's supposedly the perfect balance. But in 2026, that formula is broken because bonds don't protect you against inflation the way they used to, and that supposed perfect balance was designed for an economy that doesn't exist anymore. Instead, you need to think about your portfolio as a way to protect your real wealth against the reality of living in a world where the cost of everything is skyrocketing. That might look completely different from the portfolios your parents built or the advice you read in financial books written years ago. The fourth part of the new money formula is about thinking differently about debt and specifically understanding which debts are actually hurting you and which ones might actually be helping you in the current economic environment. This is going to sound controversial, but hear me out. Not all debt is created equal, and in 2026, carrying strategic debt while you're building wealth might actually be smarter than paying everything off aggressively. If you have a mortgage at 3 or 4% interest and inflation is running at 5%, then your debt is actually getting cheaper in real terms every single year. Your monthly payment stays the same, but the purchasing power of that payment decreases as inflation goes up. Meanwhile, the asset that your mortgage is financing, which is your home, is probably increasing in value much faster than your mortgage payment. That's actually a good financial position to be in. On the other hand, high interest debt like credit card debt at 22% interest is still absolutely toxic and should be eliminated as quickly as possible because no inflation adjustment or clever financial argument changes the fact that you're bleeding money to interest payments. The key is being smart enough to understand which debts are working for you and which debts are working against you. Strategic debt can actually accelerate your wealth building in 2026 because borrowed money that's locked in at a low rate and used to buy assets that appreciate is one of the most powerful wealth building tools available to regular people. The fifth element of the new money formula that almost nobody talks about anymore is building actual real-world skills and expertise that are directly tied to earning power. In 2026, having a degree from a fancy university doesn't guarantee anything anymore. And honestly, 4-year degrees are increasingly becoming less relevant and more expensive than ever. What actually matters is having skills that people need right now in this economy. If you can design, if you can code, if you can write, if you can analyze data, if you can sell, if you can manage people or projects, these are the skills that translate directly into earning power. The old formula used to be get a degree, get a job, stay at that job for 40 years, collect a pension, but nobody has pensions anymore, and jobs definitely don't last 40 years. So the new formula is about continuously investing in yourself and your skills because that's the single best investment you can make. When you invest in your own education and skill development, you're investing in the one asset that absolutely cannot be taken away from you. Your employer can lay you off. The stock market can crash. Real estate values can decline, but nobody can take away the knowledge and skills that you've built in your brain. This is why the people who are actually thriving in 2026 are people who are constantly learning and adapting and developing new skills that match what the market actually needs. They're not sitting around hoping that the old formula still works. They're actively evolving and growing and positioning themselves to be valuable in a constantly changing economy. The sixth and final major component of the new money formula is about thinking completely differently about retirement, because the whole concept of retirement has changed so dramatically. The old model was work for 40 years and then retire at 65 and live off a pension and Social Security. But that model is completely broken now. Social Security is underfunded and might not even exist in its current form by the time many people reach retirement age. Pensions are basically extinct outside of government jobs. People are living longer than ever before, which means you need significantly more money to fund a 30-year retirement than you would have needed 20 years ago. So the new formula isn't really about retiring in the traditional sense. It's about building enough wealth and enough passive income that you can move away from trading your hours for money and instead focus on work that actually matters to you. Whether that's a business you own, creative pursuits, consulting, or even just taking some years off in the middle of your career if you want to. This is called financial flexibility rather than traditional retirement, and it's a much more realistic and achievable goal in the current economy. You're not aiming for a specific age when you magically stop working. You're aiming for a level of wealth and passive income where you have genuine choices about how you spend your time. The beautiful thing about the new money formula is that each element builds on the previous ones and creates a system that's actually designed for the economy we live in today, rather than some fantasy version from decades ago. You start with a substantial emergency fund that protects you against the instability of the current world. You build multiple income streams so that you're never dependent on a single employer. You protect yourself against inflation by being strategic about what assets you own and where you keep your wealth. You're smart about debt instead of treating it like it's all bad or all good. You continuously invest in yourself and your skills. And you work toward financial flexibility rather than some arbitrary retirement age. Follow this sequence and you'll actually be building real wealth in 2026 instead of following instructions that made sense in 1996. Your future self will absolutely thank you for adapting to reality instead of pretending that the world hasn't changed.